Well, joining us this afternoon is Dr. Michael Ward. He is Senior Research Fellow at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford, and Professor of Apologetics at Houston Baptist University. He is the author of the best-selling and award-winning Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. He is also the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis and the presenter of the BBC television documentary, The Narnia Code. It has been argued that Dr. Ward's main claim to fame is that he handed a pair of X-ray spectacles to James Bond in the movie The World Is Not Enough. And of course, that's just a small sliver of Dr. Ward's experiences and accolades. So Dr. Ward, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Cap. Thanks, Shannon. Very good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, as the article that this interview is going to become will state, we'll have a few paragraphs leading up to the questions and answers we're going to go through. It'll kind of provide an intro to your book, After Humanity, and explain how it is a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, just so people are aware of, okay, this is what we're talking about here. And so that will lead up all to these questions here. And so our first question really is that the title of your book is After Humanity, which could sound almost post-apocalyptic to some. And so our question was, how did you decide on this particular title?
Yeah, it's, I suppose, a little bit post-apocalyptic, but then so is Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. I mean, The Abolition of Man is pretty apocalyptic. After Humanity reflects that, but also by using humanity rather than man, we get around one of the the aspects of the dated style of Lewis, because these days man tends not to mean humanity; it tends to mean male.
Right.
That's one reason for going in that direction. Another is that there's a nod in the title to Alistair MacIntyre's great work, After Virtue, one of the most influential works of philosophy of the last 30 or 40 years. And After Virtue is, I would argue, very similar, perhaps even indebted to The Abolition of Man. And I have the picture of Alistair MacIntyre in After Humanity and quote from After Virtue several times. So that's another reason for the title. And then the third reason is that, well, although it's not a work of Christian apologetics, The Abolition of Man does look in a Christian direction at various times, not least with a quotation from John's Gospel as the final quotation in the appendix of The Abolition of Man, words from Jesus about unless a seed die, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. And that's a little nod that Lewis makes towards his Christian commitments, even in this avowedly philosophical work. It's his suggestion to the reader, really, that it's to Jesus Christ that people should look if they're really looking after humanity. And that's a little kind of wordplay that I make to indicate precisely that Christian gesture that Lewis himself makes. But whether people pick up on that, I don't know. Perhaps I'm being too subtle. Anyway, those are the reasons for the title.
That sounds great.
Very mercurial of you.
Yeah, thank you. There are, perhaps you noticed, Shannon, there are various little bits of wordplay and hidden allusion in Planet Narnia too.
Oh, yes, and in Narnia Code. Those are
yes,
very punny. I find that very nice. And I like how you put it looks in a Christian direction. That's a really good, succinct way to speak about what he's doing in Abolition of Man. But number two, the second question is, after Planet Narnia and the Narnia Code, what made this your next major scholarly work? We were also wondering if there was any connection between Planet Narnia and After Humanity.
Yes, the main reason why this became my next major piece of scholarly work is that I was asked to write a foreword to an edition of The Abolition of Man, which never actually saw the light of day for various complicated reasons. But that foreword grew and grew and grew and expanded until it became After Humanity, and by various twists and turns, it became a major scholarly undertaking, which had never, I'd never sort of deliberately set out to study the abolition of man for my own sake, but just because I was asked to, I began to look at it. And also, having taught C.S. Lewis for many years now, and found that my pupils often have difficulty understanding the abolition of man, I was aware that people need help to grasp what Lewis is on about in this book. So that was another reason for making this project fairly serious and in-depth, so that I could, use it with my own students. But you ask whether there's a connection between The Abolition of Man and Planet Narnia, and yes, I think there is. There are probably several connections, actually. One is that The Abolition of Man, of course, opens with a discussion of a school textbook, what Lewis calls the Green Book, though it was really called The Control of Language. And Lewis really trains his fire against this school textbook because he thinks it's dishonest. It's smuggling into a book on supposedly literary criticism. It's smuggling in subjectivist philosophy, which he thinks is dishonest and particularly dangerous for very impressionable children. If you're going to advance a subjectivist philosophy, do it openly, like I.A. Richards does. And I.A. Richards lies behind The Control of Language. And Lewis talks about Richards once or twice within the pages of The Abolition of Man. So Lewis had a concern for children and how they would be raised, and the sorts of positions they would be encouraged to take. And although he was irritated severely by the Green Book, he was not of the view that nothing in the way of a value system should be imparted to children. It should be done through the imagination, not through works of supposed literary criticism. So in his imaginative works, namely Narnia, aimed principally at children, Lewis does indeed impart his own Christian worldview, which is deeply embedded into the whole Narnian world. And so you could say that the Narnia books are a kind of counterblast, a counterbalance to, and a proper counterbalance to the improper way in which children are being conditioned by Gaius and Titius in the Green Book. I don't think Lewis himself can be accused of inconsistency on this point, because in a story you expect to be admitted to a particular worldview, which will have all sorts of philosophical and maybe spiritual, theological assumptions underneath it. That's to be expected. So that's one connection. Another is that, of course, within the Narnian world, there's a strong moral ecology on display, and I have a whole section in After Humanity detailing certain examples within each of the Narnia chronicles of moral laws or moral principles that tie in with the duties and laws that he details in The Abolition of Man. The most explicit connection between the two books is really when Lewis in The Abolition of Man is talking about how the ancient Jews, the Hebrews in the Old Testament, refer to the law as having truth. And in a note in The Abolition of Man, he gives the Hebrew word for that, and it's emeth. And he talks about this in a note to chapter 1 of The Abolition of Man. And keen-eyed readers of the Narnia books will, of course, there recognise the name of the faithful Calamine soldier, Emeth, in the last battle. Of course, when Lewis wrote The Abolition of Man, he hadn't yet published or even probably conceived of the 7 volumes of the Narnia books. He'd given a very rough early draft of the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by that stage, but he hadn't got any distance with the book, let alone with its sequels. But it's very interesting to see how even in The Abolition of Man, he's interested in this term emeth, which means truth, faithfulness, fidelity, permanence, and he uses that again for the noble Calamine soldier in the final Chronicle of Narnia. And one final connection between the two books is that, of course, in The Abolition of Man, Lewis is talking about the human person in 3 parts. He has this model of the human person divided into the head, the chest, and the belly. And he says the head should rule the belly through the chest. And the chest is this liaison officer between rational man and visceral man. From the neck up, we're just spiritual beings, as it were. We're purely rational, and in that respect we are like the angels, or possibly like the demons if we're corrupt. From the belly down, we are like the animals. We have senses and passions and feelings and emotions. But in the chest, we connect the two, and it's the chest that makes us rational animals, this peculiar hybrid. And the chest is the place where passions should be stabilized. This is the seat of magnanimity, the place of just sentiments, civilized sentiments. So the chest is what makes us human, according to The Abolition of Man. And it's very interesting how in Narnia we see the chest physically, the physiological chest, not the philosophical chest, receiving attention from various points of view. So Peter Pevensey grows up to be a great-chested warrior, whereas Shift, the ape, the villain of the last battle, we're told that he says apes always have very weak chests. So you have the strong-chested Peter, you have the weak-chested Shift, and that's a nod to, this philosophical model in The Abolition of Man. But also Narnia itself, the geographical area which is Narnia, is itself something of a chest-like region between the hot southern countries of Calaman and the surrounding nations, which are very passionate and sensual and cruel. But to the north of Narnia, the land becomes stony and rocky and cold, and the northern witches live there. And in 3 of the Narnia Chronicles, it's northern witches who are the main enemy. So in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, you've got the White Witch, who's covering the land of Narnia in snow and ice. You've got a northern witch in Jadis, in The Magician's Nephew, and similarly in The Silver Chair, the Green Lady, the witch of the underworld. 3 Narnian witches from the north, but then in The Horse and His Boy and the Last Battle, you've got dangers coming from the south, from the land of Calaman, the land of heat and passion. So Narnia itself is trying to mediate between these 2 extremes, as it were, and is a kind of, therefore a topographical or a national instantiation of the chest-like region. Though, of course, it's all very, very subtle, and you only pick up on this if you know The Pilgrim's Regress, where Lewis uses this north and south imagery much more explicitly in an avowed allegory. But in Narnia, it's not allegorical. You just have to pick up on these meanings, as they shine by their own light. But Narnia is that central region, that middle way. And as Lewis likes to say, goodness is always a middle way for King Alfred as much as for Aristotle. It's the balancing between the extremes. So yes, there are all sorts of interesting connections between Narnia and the Abolition of Man.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
I loved especially talking about the geography of Narnia. I'd never seen that, and that's there.
That's amazing. That's really cool. Well, you had mentioned earlier in your answer to this question just about Lewis's concern for children and how they are indoctrinated and raised up. And so that leads really into our third question, which is, the subtitle of The Abolition of Man, which I believe is Lewis's own choice, is Reflections on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of Schools. Very Puritan there. And so the question is abolition, therefore, a book chiefly about education and aimed either, primarily or exclusively at educators?
Yes, that long and wordy subtitle has always slightly bemused me, and I think myself that it's possibly Lewis operating slightly tongue in cheek, because he's given such an alarmist title to this work, The Abolition of Man, and then this almost unnecessarily long subtitle, Reflections on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of School. It's so specific. And I think myself that it's partly to, here's a really dry and dusty subtitle, so don't be alarmed by the dystopic post-apocalyptic title. This is going to be a serious work of philosophy. But also it's actually, I think it's a nod to the Green Book, to this control of language that he's attacking in the first chapter, because that book itself was addressed to students in the upper forms of schools. So Lewis adds in that phrase, upper forms of schools, I think as a little piece of sardonic homage to the Green Book. Which isn't to say that he's, there's not a serious engagement with questions of education. That is indeed part of Lewis's strategy in The Abolition of Man. But really the Green Book, the control of language, is just a kind of springboard into his philosophical case. He's using it as a foil. And we know that partly because he doesn't bother to tell us the real title and the real authors. It's really called The Control of Language by Alec King and Martin Ketley, but Lewis calls it The Green Book by Gaius and Titius. It's a mistake, I think, for readers to get too hung up on the Green Book and the precise arguments of the Green Book. It's just a device, a rhetorical device, really, for Lewis to get into his case against subjectivism. And we can see that because by the time of the third chapter of The Abolition of Man, there are only 3 chapters. In the third and final chapter of The Abolition of Man, there's no reference to the Green Book or to Gaius and Titius. It's fallen away like a booster rocket on a launch to the moon. It's got Lewis's argument off the ground, as it were, and now we can pay attention to his real subject, which is subjectivism, the poison of subjectivism, as he calls it elsewhere. Which isn't to say that moral education isn't a serious issue for him within the pages of The Abolition of Man. No, that would be a wrong conclusion to draw. Moral education is absolutely foundational to the point that he's making, but moral formation goes on not just in the upper forms of schools, let alone within the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools. Moral education goes on from a baby's birth onwards, or you might even argue from the baby's conception onwards. And it goes on in the home and in the church and in every level, every form of the school, because we only become moral human beings by imbibing a moral atmosphere, which hopefully is being breathed in and out by everyone we meet, whether they're teachers or not. So we shouldn't get too waylaid by the specific question of classroom pedagogy. It's not a book of that kind with regard to educational theory. It's much broader and deeper than that.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah,
excellent.
Excellent. So the next question was about, in the marketing for After Humanity, it is said that Abolition of Man has even more relevance now than it did when it was first published. How would you say abolition even presciently addresses our current cultural climate?
Yes, a good question. In so many ways, it's really a very prescient and prophetic work. Um, One way in which it foresaw the developments that would subsequently manifest themselves, because of course it's written in the 1940s, and so much has changed since then. One of the ways is in this attitude that we take to our own human nature. Lewis is arguing that we will effectively abolish our own integrity, our own dignity as a human race, if we embrace subjectivism, as he fears that we are going to embrace it, and indeed already have begun to embrace it. We will begin to, as it were, treat ourselves as objects rather than as subjects, because of course his argument is quite subtle. Although he's arguing for the objectivity of moral law, he's arguing that moral law is a premise, it's not a conclusion, that we already find ourselves within this moral law, what he calls the Tao. We have to accept it as a given. We can't argue to it, we must argue from it. We're already participating in it by virtue of being human. This is one of the things which makes us human. He's arguing that very point. So although it's an objective reality which we didn't make up, it's not objective in the sense that we control it, that we can master it. No, indeed, quite the contrary. We must submit to it. We must surrender to it and grow up within it. It's like a trellis, almost like you would train a growing rose, a climbing rose against. But if you take the opposite view, that moral law is something that we just invent, that we create according to our own subjective preferences, well then there is this sort of master-slave attitude that develops. And so you can do whatever you like, because there's nothing that is objectively real in the moral world. No, it's just whatever you happen to choose. So if you happen to decide that, for instance, if you're a pregnant woman, if you happen to decide that you don't want the baby, kill it. When Lewis wrote in 1943, abortion in the United Kingdom was still illegal. By the 1960s, it had become the law of the land. Happiness consists in conforming oneself, that's the right word, to reality, not twisting reality to suit your own convenience, or your own desires, or your own very understandable needs and passions, because we all have all sorts of difficulties in coming to terms with reality. So the common modern day phrase about speaking my truth connects very, very precisely with this prophecy that Lewis is making, that we'll all just determine reality according to our own particular perspective. Which isn't to say that Lewis is against the value of us as individuals, that he's wanting to completely steamroller personal perspectives. On the contrary, he has a very high estimation of the individual. He was something of an individualist himself, but it's the duty of the individual, it's the responsibility of the individual to try as far as possible to overcome any bias, and to perceive reality as correctly as possible. We can never escape our own subjective viewpoint. God has made us with that subjective viewpoint, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. We shouldn't be embarrassed by it. But at the same time, we should recognize that we're in community, and that there's a real world out there to which we have to try to conform ourselves as much as is appropriate. So those are some of the ways in which I think Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, presciently addresses our current cultural climate.
Excellent. Great. That's yeah, great stuff.
Yeah. So with your basically it's saying that the subjective has kind of triumphed in our culture, and this is what he foresaw happening. Like this is
Yes, absolutely. That the idea of there being a kind of medium of practical rationality, or what you might call, what I prefer to call this sort of moral ecology or atmosphere that we all breathe in, which is the same for us all, that we have to participate in. Rather than that, no, we're all, as it were, locked up in our own sort of space suits. We're breathing our own oxygen that we generate. And to that extent, we're in our own little ecosystem. And we can never actually interact with other people on common ground, because there is no common ground.
no.
I make the universe from my own will. There's no reason but my will. And so Lewis will quote Juvenal, the great Roman satirist, saying, "This I will, so I command. Let my will take the place of reason." So to that extent, what Lewis is talking about is very much in accord with this Nietzschean will to power, that I will assert my own dignity, I will assert my own status as a Superman, and let the devil take the hindmost, as it were. And yeah, it's not a good situation to be in.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So the next question we have is that C.S. Lewis's most popular works are explicitly or predominantly Christian, and so with your early scholarly work, Planet Narnia, there's almost kind of a built-in Christian audience because people are reading Narnia still; they're very interested in it. But with Abolition being a strictly philosophical work, what would you say about after humanity can and should interest Christians who aren't normally interested in philosophy?
Yes, I would agree that many of Lewis's most popular works are explicitly Christian, obviously mere Christianity, and the problem of pain and miracles and so on and so forth. I wouldn't myself call the Narnia books explicitly Christian. They are implicitly Christian. And you can read the Narnia books without picking up on the Christian subtext. Or even if you realize that it's there, you may choose not to make that the focus of your reading. The Narnia books do not demand to be read in an explicitly Christian fashion, which is partly why they have become such classics and they've entered the mainstream. And all sorts of people enjoy Narnia for purely literary and mythological and moral reasons, not necessarily for any particularly Christian reasons. But of course, those Christian reasons are to be enjoyed there if you wish to pick up on them. And obviously, I try to bring those out in my book Planet Narnia. The Abolition of Man is, like Narnia, aimed at not a peculiarly Christian readership.
Mm-hmm.
But it's even more broadly based than Narnia, because in The Abolition of Man, Lewis is advancing a purely philosophical argument. He makes this very clear in the course of his argument. He says, "Though I am myself a theist and indeed a Christian, I'm not attempting here any even indirect argument for theism." So he's setting his sights very low there. Not even an indirect argument for theism, let alone a direct argument for Christianity. All he's trying to do in The Abolition of Man is establish this baseline of moral reality, of moral objectivity, the Tao as he calls it. That's what makes us human. It's an argument in philosophical anthropology, the abolition of man. It's not a work of Christian apologetics, or even a work of theology more generally. So it's important not, I think, to precipitately Christianize the abolition of man. I think we ought to take it on its own terms.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I try to point out some of the Christian, some of the subliminal Christian elements that are there, but it's not a Christian case that he's advancing. So your question is, what is it about after humanity, or what is it about the abolition of man that should interest Christians who aren't normally interested in philosophy? Well, Christians hopefully are interested in engaging with their non-Christian neighbours, and one of the things Lewis is providing us in the pages of the Abolition of Man is just such an engagement. You can't be a Christian human being until you're a human being first. So what is it that makes us human? And this is his answer. What makes us human is this moral ecology that we all participate in. Mm-hmm. From a Christian point of view, you would want to argue, like St. Paul does in the letter to the Romans, that this is a manifestation of the image of God in man. This is the conscience speaking to us. The conscience being, in the words of John Henry Newman, the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. That this is the word of God sounding deep within our own nature. But you can argue it from another point of view, which is purely anthropological, not theological, and I think Christians who are wanting to get some sort of common ground with their non-Christian neighbours would do well to look at this. Mm. Not least with their non-Christian neighbours who are, to use that old phrase, men of goodwill. There are Jews of goodwill, there are Muslims of goodwill, there are atheists of goodwill, there are people who are alive to the moral light in the universe, and are trying to live according to it. And there are plenty of Christians, supposed Christians, who are dead to it. So that kind of common ground, I think, is one of the main things that Christians should take away from the abolition of man, and it's one of the things I try to bring out in After Humanity. I have a whole chapter on whether the abolition of man is actually a religious work, and I say, well, no, it's not explicitly religious, but yes, from this other more general point of view. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How would you compare Lewis the philosopher to Lewis the theologian, and is one of them harder to understand than the other?
Well, it's important to bear in mind that Lewis studied philosophy and taught philosophy at Oxford, but he never studied theology or taught theology at Oxford. Lewis never did a degree in theology. He never had a position in theology at Oxford. So from an academic point of view, Lewis was, as it were, more serious as a philosopher than he was as a theologian. And that's perhaps why the abolition of man is as hard and difficult as it is, which is why it needs this guide. When he's operating as a theologian, he's operating as a well-read Christian who understands spiritual and religious issues, both from a literary historical point of view, that was his speciality after all, and from the point of view of a believing Christian who's trying to live the spiritual life. So when he's operating in theological mode in Mere Christianity and those other books, he's very naturally operating at a much more sort of general level, not at the high academic level that he does operate at when he's in philosophical mode. I think it would be true to say that Lewis the philosopher is harder to understand than Lewis the theologian, and that's partly because of his background in each topic, but but more to do with the audience that he's selected to address in these different books. Of course, even as a philosopher, Lewis would sometimes, as it were, operate at a more populist level, and so there are versions of his argument in The Abolition of Man which operate at a much lower level, much more accessible level. He wrote, short articles like the Poison of Subjectivism and his essay on ethics, and indeed the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity are, you might say, a popularization of The Abolition of Man. So he could bring it down to the more more general popular level and operate in a more kind of vernacular register. I'm not wanting to say that all his philosophy is highfalutin and inaccessible, but The Abolition of Man is certainly one of his harder works. Yes.
Yeah.
So at the end of your book, After Humanity, there are over 30 questions for discussion. Love those. Love just working through those and thinking through those ourselves. But one of those questions we thought would be a good question to ask you, or just modify slightly and ask you. So how might Abolition of Man have been better or worse if Lewis had argued for a theistic or a Christian basis for morality?
Well, it would, from the Christian point of view, have been better if he'd argued for a theistic or a Christian basis for morality, in that it would have gone further into theism and Christianity, which theists and Christians obviously believe to be true. And if you want theism and Christianity to be served up to you in whatever book you read, then you would regard that as an improvement, I suppose. I'm a theist, I'm a Christian, but I don't require every book to go all the way into theism and Christianity myself. So I think it's easier to point out how the book would have been worse if he had gone in that direction rather than how it would have been better. It would have been worse because it would have left behind all those readers who aren't theists and Christians, who nonetheless want some kind of philosophical justification for objective value. One doesn't need to, as a Christian, one doesn't need to present the whole of the gospel on every single occasion. You can narrow things down. Just take a baby step, as it were. Just get as far as this anthropological definition and the manifestation of the conscience, and argue for its reality. That's a good thing to do. That's worth nailing down, as it were. Because once you've got that position secured, then the next step towards theism is going to be easier. And then once you're at theism, it's going to be easier to get to Christianity. So everything leads to everything else. And I think The Abolition of Man would have been worse if he tried to get in everything. The Abolition of Man is an incredibly dense and difficult work, just securing this point about the objectivity of value. If he tried to get in God and Christ as well, and keep it within the same bounds, everything would have become so thin and quick that it wouldn't have had the same substance and the same heft. Of course, there are tracts that do that, and good on them. There's not saying a word against them, but that's not what Lewis is attempting to do here.
In several places, your book mentions scientism, which is defined as the increasingly prevalent trust in science for the answer to all our questions about life and meaning. How would Lewis, in Abolition of Man or otherwise, speak to that belief? Or I guess he would probably term it naturalism.
Yes. Lewis, in the course of The Abolition of Man, says at one point that nothing I can say will prevent some people from taking my argument as an attack upon science. Lewis dares to raise a question about science, but he's not thereby attacking it. He's wanting to specify the boundaries of science. The scientific method is good in certain areas and not good when it gets outside those areas. That's not an attack upon science. On the contrary, you could argue that it's a defense of science, and a defense of science within its proper boundaries. But scientism is when you reduce all forms of knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge, as if all the other disciplines that there are valueless. But that's absurd, and no serious scientist really argues that. It's the little scientists and the little little followers of popular science, Lewis argues, who take that view. The great minds, the great scientific minds, he says, know that something has been lost when you try to reduce all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. I found a very helpful quotation from a book by Paul Holmer. He wrote an early study of Lewis called C.S. Lewis, The Shape of His Faith and Thought. And in that book, I'll just quote a little bit of it, if I may.
Sure.
So this is Paul Holmer. Not for a moment is Lewis denying that there is a world around us that, in an obvious sense, is there to be known and described. On the other hand, he's not denying that people are people, that we are typically the ones who have the ideas, the emotions, the purposes. In this sense, we are subjects, not objects. The difference is that Lewis will not concur with the notion that the language of science is uniquely objective. Furthermore, he rejects categorically the view that there is only one literal language that reproduces the structures of the world. There is no norm in one kind of language that is particularly factual and about the world, whereas all other ways of speaking are more or less subjective. Paul Holmer goes on, this must be said with great care. Lewis is not one to deny the advantage of technical language for its given purposes. Technical language there meaning scientific language. But he does deny the philosophical notion called positivism or subjectivism, which suggests that a singular kind of discourse is factual. Partly this is so because Lewis knows both the ambiguity of the concept fact and the many ways in which words work. There prove to be many ways of speaking about what is. The fact-value distinction, therefore, is abrogated. Seeing facts is not an exclusive prerogative of any one discipline. The world has no single character and must be understood in a variety of ways. To read it with everything moral and aesthetic abstracted out of it is to make it a caricature of itself. To read it with these factors admitted is to see the very logic and sense of the world. Now that's very well put, I think. Morality and the objectivity of value is part of the logic of the world, and to suggest that facts are value-free and facts are only accessible by means of inductive empirical science, that's just reductive. And no real scientist lives his or her life according to that belief. It's good for a slapdown argument in a debate, where Richard Dawkins can say science flies people to the moon, religion flies planes into buildings, and that's just preposterous. That's a cheap shot. It would be as cheap as a religious person saying that science gives us mustard gas, whereas religion gives us schools and hospitals. That's just cheap. Scientism is a corruption of science. Science, properly understood, is a noble undertaking. Many great Christians are scientists. Lewis is not saying a word against science properly understood. He's just wanting to say history, philosophy, literature, art, sociology, whatever other discipline you care to mention, will all have their own particular angles on the truth, with their own particular languages, and we need one another in order to make sense of the world.
Hmm.
I love that. And I love that quote. That speaks so well to what first attracted me to C.S. Lewis, because I had been indoctrinated to believe that my major in literature was just kind of, I don't know, trivial. It wasn't a gateway into understanding more about objective reality. And C.S. Lewis made it very clear that understanding literature and reading literature and enjoying stories actually is a gateway into understanding more about reality. I think that was one of the things, even before I could put that into words, that I enjoyed about him.
Yes, I think he would probably want to say it can be a gateway.
Yes.
It
It can also be a gateway into unreality.
Yes, exactly. It's not necessarily a gateway because there's plenty of bad art and literature out there, just as there's plenty of bad science out there.
Yeah.
We've got to grow up and not be so naive and say science good, art bad. I mean, that's just pathetic.
Very good. I really enjoyed that. That was great.
Excellent. Okay, well, so we're down to our last question here, and you've done a lot of original research for After Humanity, and so we just wanted to ask, what are some of the new things you'd like to highlight, or some of the things you've been particularly excited to unearth just during this process?
Ooh, well, I'll just grab my copy of the book.
Sure.
So some of the most fun things have found their way into the photo gallery.
Okay.
I'm very proud of the 30 plus images that Word on Fire Academic have allowed me to include in the book.
That has been fun.
Yeah, one of them is this photograph there of Lewis in uniform alongside his friend Paddy Moore, who alas died in the Great War. And as a result of Paddy Moore's death, C.S. Lewis's life was completely changed because C.S. Lewis had made a promise to look after Paddy's mother and sister if Paddy should be killed. And as a result of Paddy's death, Lewis, spent the next several decades living with these two women who became a kind of surrogate mother and sister to him.
Right.
And I put this photograph in After Humanity because one of the arguments that Lewis makes in The Abolition of Man is that the crucial test of the objectivity of value is death for a good cause. For as long as our moral behavior doesn't cause us any difficulty or suffering, we might be inclined to suppose, well, it's just subjectively convenient to us. But as soon as we actually have to suffer or undergo some problem in order to live up to a moral truth, well, then it becomes a bit clearer that it's really objective. We're not just choosing things that suit us. Sometimes doing the right thing is really hard, might even cause us our death. So in The Abolition of Man, Lewis talks about death for a good cause, dying for one's country as the experimentum crucis, the crucial experiment or critical experiment. And I think this autobiographical background detail of Lewis and his friend Paddy, I think we would do well to remember that. It helps account, I think, for some of the seriousness and the moral authority that Lewis speaks with in The Abolition of Man, because he not only had lost a close friend, but he himself, C.S. Lewis, had very nearly been killed in service of his country. He was hit by a shell that fell in his trench in the spring of 1918, and I'll read you what he said in his autobiography. He recalled the moment just after I'd been hit, when I found, or thought I found, that I was not breathing, and concluded that this was death. The proposition, "here is a man dying," stood before my mind as dry, as factual, as unemotional as something in a textbook. So he'd come this close to dying himself, and yet it hadn't shaken his belief in the objective value of self-sacrifice. So I think that's not only important for an understanding of the abolition of man, but it's pleasing to me to be able to reproduce this photograph, because this photograph with both men identified in it has never been published before. It appeared in another biography with Lewis identified, but not Paddy Moore.
Wow.
So that was one thing, one fun thing, and another fun thing is the original blurb that Lewis wrote. This short little paragraph that he wrote promoting the abolition of man, when it was due to come out in 1943, and nobody has ever turned this up before. It's deep in the archives of the University of Durham, and even the great Walter Hooper, Lewis's main editor and biographer, even Walter Hooper never discovered this. So I'm very proud to have, well, A, discovered it, and B, got permission from the C.S. Lewis estate to reproduce it. And there are various other fun things in the photo gallery, but I'll leave readers to discover those themselves.